I'm very happy EKATERINA DEGOT is going to talk tonight under the title Framing Artists for the Art, Curatorial Montage as Meaning Production. Our series of lectures this year is under the title Production of Meaning, and I would like to introduce you very briefly EKATERINA DEGOT. She's born in Moscow and is right now artistic director of the Academy of the Arts of the World in Cologne. She got in last year the Hito Steyerl Award for Culture and Theory. She is an art historian, writer and curator, and has curated and wrote many exhibitions and books. I just mentioned her last book, which is called Post-Soviet Art, Politics and Society in Russia at the Turn of the Decade, which she edited together with two other authors. And their names are for me too difficult to pronounce right now, sorry. And her last exhibition was, which is mentioned in the biography I found at the Academy of the Arts of the World. It was the first Bergen assembly under the title Monday Begins on Saturday in 2013. Please welcome with me EKATERINA DEGOT.
I have to, is it okay like that? Who's the king of the microphone? Thank you very much for the warm introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here with you. Thank you for being here by such a nice weather, so you prefer to be inside. As said, I'm a curator, and what I will be talking about is my recent thoughts on the profession curator, on the gesture of curating, which we curators share with artists. That will be one of my points. So I will be talking about different things. And I actually found myself recently unable to multitasking. So when I'm speaking, I'm usually forgetting to show images. I don't know how it is with you, so I decided that I will speak by chunks, and a chunk of text and then a chunk of images. So it will be maybe easier to all of us, but we'll start with this famous Marcel Brother's installation as a beginning for the beginning of my talk. It is often debated whether curators should get the right to be called artists by themselves or by someone else. And Anton Vidocle recently wrote a passionate piece against this situation, blaming curators for being unethical in usurpation of artists' rights. Still, I must say, I never heard a curator directly saying, I'm an artist, you know. While many artists actually became curators and create great exhibitions. And there are some art historians who claim that actually artists were at the core of first artist exhibition like those by Marcel Duchamp, or surrealists were at the beginning of the curatorial profession rather than the other way around. So artists actually do become curators and create exhibitions where they could use works by other artists, or research installations where they use works by other artists, which was already the case of Marcel Brother's, because what he actually used were already artworks, although he claimed that they are not. Famously, in this installation, they said each piece has an inscription, this is not a work of art. If some time ago one could have suspected that curators aspired to wear the artist's hat, as the artist was the ultimate metaphor in the creative field, now it is the curator's hat that might be on the wish of many, on the wish list of many. Curating is also one of the spheres where it has become more and more difficult to divide theory from practice. Even if there is a theorist of curating, and he doesn't curate any exhibition, but he cannot or she cannot escape being called a practicing curator, as organizing conferences, moderating talks, editing books, everything like that now qualifies as curating as well. We all are curators now, but we all are also curated from time to time. The contemporary institutional landscape of discourse production, in one of those institutions who are here now, those institutions make everybody surrender to someone else curating at some point. When a curator, author, for instance, is taking part in a book project or in a conference or in a complex show, including different parts, he's also curated. And curating, and is curating on another or even the same occasion. This is a very complex play where everybody more or less knows the rules in art field. Nevertheless, this debate about artists and curators misses the point, in my opinion. It is not as if curators want to take the place of a traditional autonomous creator, at least not anymore. It is the product curators and increasingly artists provide, a heterogeneous interdisciplinary display in space or time that is seen as the new form of an artwork now. This artwork requires a specific way of seeing, reading, and evaluating that is different from how we approach an individual artist's work. But this specific way of seeing is already fully mastered by the art professionals who know how to do it, and you know it as well. So all art professionals, even if there was no, like, without any conversation and any theoretical consensus about it, everybody knows how to read the latest show by Okwui Enwezor, for instance, as opposed to how to see and read the latest film by Hito Steyerl. So this is this heterogeneous art display is the ultimate artwork, which we have now. That is a part of Anselm Franke's famous animism show, so curatorial display. That can be also an artistic one. This is Eric Beltran installation, which looks basically the same. So this is Hito Steyerl's film, which some of you might have seen in the last Venice Biennial, where she even shows us how to watch her film. It means sitting or almost lying down in those chaiselongs, being there, watching it from the beginning to the end, relaxed, having seen. So to see this film, we must be those who have seen it, from the beginning to the end. That is the point which she is stressing with her installation. With the show of Okwui Enwezor, which includes things like that, it is clear that you are just unable to see it from the beginning to the end. It's totally impossible. And people who were meeting each other, they're professionals, curators, critics who visited their opening days, the preview of Venice Biennial, even if it lasts 3 or 4 days. So they were exchanging phrases like, have you seen this show? Yes, I have seen some of it. What have you seen? I have seen this part. What have you seen? I have seen that part. Okay, and everybody understands and assumes that it's totally impossible to see the show as a whole, to see all the presented films, videos, or series of drawings, texts from the beginning to the end is absolutely impossible and actually not even needed. So it is not included in the notion, I have seen the latest show by Okwui Enwezor. So if you say, I have seen the film by Hito Steyerl, you're really saying that you have seen this film. If you're saying that I have seen the film of Okwui Enwezor, I have seen the show of Okwui Enwezor, nobody actually expects you to have seen all of it. And if we think about it, this is unusual. Can you, for instance, imagine a theater critic who would start his review by saying, you know what, I just have seen the first 15 minutes of this play, but here is my opinion. Or a literary critic who would say the same about a novel, but it's actually a situation which is totally accepted in art field. Someone who's writing even a review about the exhibition of Okwui Enwezor is not supposed to have seen everything. So this is what's interesting for me is this gesture acceptance of this situation. So their film has to be in the whole, and the exhibition can be only seen in fragments. It is, of course, especially the case of biennials, but increasingly for other exhibitions as well. But then, okay, people say, I have seen the show, I have seen the show of Okwui Enwezor. What have I seen? As it is well known, any activity of selecting certain things, putting them together and displaying them publicly is now called curating. Those things can be material, but like artworks or even cars or jewelry, it's also called curating now. But they also can be immaterial, like ideas, positions, and of course artists, people who speak at the conference, they are also curated. Display can take place physically in space or on paper or in totally immaterial discursive sphere. Curating becomes the central gesture of cultural and more often than not only cultural production. Maria Lind, very timely, several years ago, coined the concept of the curatorial, which represents like the political, the same kind, which represents the philosophy of curating and the general methodology of archiving, discursive display, and recontextualization that goes far beyond art. In this sense, what curating is now replacing, the gesture of curating, is replacing the equally ubiquitous role of management. I'm sorry to say. Curators are kind of new managers. Both are often understood as an intransitive notion, which means it has no object, or its object is actually irrelevant, or much less relevant than the methodology of it. As a universal tool that shuns and skips ontological issues. So we're skipping the question of what we are actually curating, what we're actually managing. So it's a caricature of a curator, but it's very close. Somehow what curator is like manager, it's a figure, a character, I would say, in a theater play of new creative capitalism. And as such a character, he or she shares those values, these situations where the object of management or of curating, we find it missing. Managers, infamously, are not specialists in their field often and not required to be. To manage, you do not have to know. And at the beginning of the professionalization of curators in the 1990s, it was often stressed, and you can find those texts, that curators should rather not be art historians by education. To be a real curator, you better not be a scientist, a historian of art, you better not know art, you better be a sociologist, politologist, or a journalist, coming from a different field. So this discourse is not there anymore. So the field of professional art historians in museums also became, those people also became curators, so they came together, but still this idea was there at the beginning of curatorial profession. So was this emergence of the figure of manager and curator in the cultural field is part of this methodological term of creative capitalism, and there is already a resistance to it in an attempt to go ontological and just to give us the broader context of what's going on, so we would not think that knowledge production is actually the only possible way for art or artists or curators to express themselves and to do things. It is not the case. Knowledge production is one of the possibilities, and there There is a strong tendency now to go beyond that, to stop identifying art and culture with knowledge production, with this methodological, the curatorial, the methodological, and to turn towards the ontology of things, towards creation, but not creation of the work of art, but creation of some real things. As you know, there is a tendency among curators, but also artists, to build something sustainable as opposed to temporary, something real as opposed to imaginary, something undoubtedly good, and there is a moral overtone in it, as opposed to ambivalently subversive or critical or reflexive. In other words, not an exhibition and not even a discursive club or a series of workshops, but rather a school, a commune, a garden, a cooperative, a system of mutual help, a time bank, a political party even. So there is a strong tendency, and something that took place recently was a Congress of Artists initiated organizations in Berlin, which strongly represented this tendency that really tries to quit the field of knowledge production, where we still are now with this talk. And of course, this tendency also tries to get rid of this profession of curator and has a director of the organization instead. So some images, discursive curating. So this is an exhibition. I will illustrate with some examples from my practice and some examples which are not from my practice. This is an exhibition, a project rather, we curated with David Riff in Moscow, which was called Auditorium Moscow. And you might see Artur Żmijewski here on the panel and members of Hito Steyerl's group. So this classical, nothing original here, classical discursive event, which was curated. So people who were invited were carefully curated by us, and in a way the audience was as well. So that's an interesting point, that by creating, so it was a discussional club on the topics of art and politics, art and urbanism, art and social space, something which was very important at that point in Moscow. It was right before the first protests against Putin started in 2011. At that point there was almost no space for such a discussion. This is why it strongly attracted some young people, young artists, students, with something we suspected whom we can get. So in a way, I had the feeling that the audience is also curated by us and part of this project. The turn towards art utile, or utilitarian art, or useful art. So this is the project by Tanya Bruguera in Eindhoven, which became famous. It's part of this tendency to go beyond the critical towards the feeling of being useful. Returning to the idea of curator and what is this curatorial role. Still the curator, I compared curator to the manager, but of course it's different. Unlike manager, curator is seen as an author. The author who is presenting his authorship, his individual narrative. So the result of curatorial work is always time-based. This is something to remember, and I'll return to it at the end of my talk. And what it produces is a narrative. And this is why curator, if I say author, but curator is close to something which is closer to something which is called auteur in this French tradition of cinéma d'auteur. Author in the narrative art field. This is why curator is very often compared to a novelist, a theater director, or a film director who's assuring the final cut, as Robert Storm, one of the famous curators, recently said. So what I want to show now, that there are two images. One is Daumier, a classical salon situation. Someone with a book, and in this book he's looking for the names of artists, or maybe for a critical text by Diderot. And here's a very typical contemporary situation. This is how the visitors of the contemporary art exhibition now look like. They are reading before or after or instead, looking at an artwork. They have to understand the context it is. They have to understand the idea of artist, but also curatorial narrative, how it is inscribed. So in this case, the exhibition was outside. They also had to find an artwork. And for that, they really had to be in the process of understanding the curatorial narrative. So what is this curatorial authorship? How we can define it? So it's certainly contradictory. So every curator, practicing curators, knows that. On the one hand, the curatorial signature, the existence of the individual name behind an exhibition or a project, is a conditio sine qua non of curator actually agreeing to do the job. And this is an assumption which everybody has. Everybody understands that the exhibition, if the curator is invited, that he has to sign out this exhibition. For independent curators, it's actually the sole capital. This is something they will be selling later. This is something which the authorship is extremely important for the CV, actually more important for the curators who are working in an institution like a museum, for instance. Because the precarity of the position of independent curator, freelance curators, makes this authorship their sole capital, as I said. It is also something which is respected by others, with biennials, for instance. It is usually accepted everywhere that the curator of a new biennial, the new edition of a biennial, creates, for instance, a new, how do you call it, design, this corporate identity. He or she brings a new team with him very often. This is, which of course creates problems. The biennial exists as an institution, but with each new edition, it's actually accepted widely that the curator insists on having his or her own team, for instance, assistants, I don't know, authors for the catalogs, editors for the catalog. It changes all the time, even if it's not really practical for the institution, but this is the right of the curator, especially in biennials, where by definition these are independent curators, or they play this role who are creating biennials. So this right of the individual choice is even stressed somehow in this role of curator. On the other hand, this authorship is relative, since there are many, many circumstances outside curator's control. And they are financial, they are organizational, there are sometimes even ideological pressure, there is some frame which is coming from the sponsor, there is some frame which is coming from the city politics, there is something which is, makes curatorial freedom and authorship actually really relative in many cases. Also, if we compare curatorial authorship to the one of the artists, like with something I started, it's really very different. It's difficult for a curator to have artist rights. For instance, curator cannot sell his or her work, obviously. But this is not the main thing, but still. Curator cannot have it properly documented for art history. And there is no such thing as catalogue raisonné for curators yet. Curator cannot have, for now at least, a retrospective of his or her oeuvre. And if he or she will want it, it will be very difficult, because it's very difficult to document. He or she doesn't even have copyright. And from where I'm coming from in Russia, for instance, It's more than possible that some institution would just use the title of your exhibition, or even just take and reconstruct your exhibition somewhere else without even asking you. Because they just liked it and they just took some fragment on it and reconstructed it. So those things are happening, and there's basically not that much law that would protect curators from it. Well, if we're talking about authorship, of course, something we have to remember is the notion of the death of the author. An argument elaborated famously in 1967 by Roland Barthes, who was polemical towards a traditional biographical approach that focused on the author's intentions. This text is one of the most famous in the humanities, but it seems only now we can actually see what sort of authorship it can describe. When it says, and I quote, "A text's unity lies not in its origin or its creator, but in its destination." As it might sound like a metaphor to writers who still have their copyrights, like copyright for writers exists, and the author is not really dead, and the text is not really changed, at least for now, the notion of authorship becomes more vague and more destination shifted in the sphere of internet, for instance, but also in the sphere of different forms of curated displays and discursive plays that emerge under the rule of the curatorial. In a way, curating is what writing becomes after the death of author. Of course, if we read the Barthes text and think about it, it does not imply that author was actually dead and that even the authorship was shaken. On the contrary, as we all know, Roland Barthes is one of the most famous names, actually, and one of the most famous authors in the history of humanities. But this is not a paradox. Retrospectively, we see it means that author names on the grave, yeah, so to speak, or on the book, yeah, what is written on the cover of the book or on his grave, is the only thing that might be stable and therefore salvatory to the author. So his work might be forever undead and in constant flux of readings, interpretations, and rewritings. You know it very well. When you start to Google Roland Barthes, for instance, death of the author, sometimes you get the real text of him, but sometimes not. Sometimes first thing you are getting is someone else's academic essay, or a Wikipedia with quotes, or even something, if you have to prepare for your students' work very quickly, you don't even have time to understand what you got, but you got some quotes from Barthes, and of course everybody knows what it is about, but where did we get this information? As we know, like 99% of people do not go to the sources now. They look somewhere on the internet. And what we are getting, maybe it's not Barthes who has written that. Maybe it's something else, but still, who is the author of the text about the death of the author? Roland Barthes. But what we are reading might be not Roland Barthes. But the name of Roland Barthes is still unstable. The name is stable, but the text is not. And so then this is the situation we live now, and this is also the situation with the curator, who is very much protecting his or her name, exactly because the exhibition itself can be unstable and in flux and not documentable, as I will say now. Sorry, just a moment, so Barthes' text is usually interpreted in the sense that authorship is not about author's solitary will, conscious will, and in the interpretation, many aspects has to be taken into account. And reader has the right to interpretation. This is how normally this text of Barthes is explained. So we all, in the postmodern sense, like we all have the right to interpret anything at all. And we are always right in this interpretation. But today I would say it affects not just interpretation, but the very reading of the text, as I just said. That the text itself, not just the interpretation of the text of Barthes, but the text itself is becoming unstable in the situation of internet. And some of the artists actually were ready for that sort of things. I guess you all know that Kazimir Malevich did not paint just one black square. He painted actually several black squares during his lifetime. And some of those black squares can actually have been painted by his pupils also. It's very possible that he painted those black squares in this academic educational context. He didn't have slides, he didn't have PowerPoint presentation. So he made his students paint another black square for him. So they painted the black square, but it only reinforced his authorship. So in this private market thinking, it is strange. Normally people in the West say, strange. Why did he paint several black squares? Because it kind of makes the first one less expensive. But this is not how he was thinking. He thought that like the more black squares there are, the stronger his authorship paradoxically is. So that's in order to strengthen his theoretical supremacy, he increased actually the amount of works almost identical and made the authorship actually vague. Another example, as I said, is internet. Another one is film and television, where you know that films are being renewed. You know that one film is already too old, so they create a new one on the same plot with other actors. So this, we still do not accept if someone will rewrite now, let's say, War and Peace by Tolstoy in a simpler way. Yeah, it's still kind of not very accepted. Yeah? So it would not be, I hope so, maybe I'm wrong, it would not be solved. But it's something which is happening with films very, very easily. So I guess we are on the way of that sort of cultural gesture. And yet another example is indeed exhibition. This multi-dimensional space described by Barthes is a quote. The one that cannot be deciphered, he say, only disentangled and read in fissures of meaning. So if the curated entity is, as Jens Hoffmann says, discursive argument realized through the display of artworks, and that's what Jens Hoffmann suggests, that an exhibition is a discursive argument, and we can add the artworks can be supplanted by artifacts of an anthropological sense, actually anything can be in the exhibition, not just artworks, then this argument is by definition incomplete and open. So an exhibition is open, unfinished, and can be interpreted and can be understood very differently. So some other points about the exhibition. So as said, exhibition cannot, difficult or impossible to see it in the whole. And curator tolerates that it will be only seen in fragments. And it's also starting to spread out into artistic practice. So for last 10 years, I would say, maybe more for most advanced artists like Fischler and Weiss, they are creating something which is, in Habermasian sense, is called unübersichtlich, something which cannot be seen, and this feeling of impossibility to see it is an important part of it. Elements that the show is built upon, these elements formerly known as individual artworks, often have been and certainly will be parts of different combinations. This is something important for a contemporary show. Actually, if we look at the figure of contemporary curator, he or she is very often working with existing artworks and putting them in interesting combinations, new combinations, or taking some forgotten artworks. This is what, for the most important exhibitions of the last years actually did. The Okwui Enwezor's Venice Biennial, the Massimiliano Giorni Venice Biennial, some other exhibitions, but this is not how curator understood its role in the 90s. So in the 90s, under this relational aesthetics of Nicolas Bouillot and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, it was very important for the curator to work with the artist on the creation of the new work, so to make it happen, to give a birth to it, so to speak. So now curators are often work with existing works, but that means that we might remember where we have seen it before and in which combination, and it's still there. Those combinations are still there. So there is a very interesting project, which unfortunately I have not seen. It's an exhibition which Mark Wallinger did, British artist, where he, in one exhibition space, he exhibited all the artworks which ever have been exhibited there in the same situation. Like a video projection and a sculpture, because it's stood there in a second show. So it's something what I mean now. So because all those contexts are somehow with those works, and curator has to accept it also, that we might prefer, for instance, to see Duchamp's work in a previous show and not this one. So the curators has to accept many things. So the exhibition is also will be dismantled. Also something which is important, that the product of curatorial work will be always abolished, will be took down, even if it's a museum show. It's not forever, it's fragile, always temporary, and it's also, as I said, undocumentable. It is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to archive the full spectrum of factors that play a role in the visitor's experience of an exhibition. For instance, quality of light, the amount of visitors, the rhythm of movement inside the space, because you're always looking with your back. Yeah, you just have seen something and you see something new, but you steal something which is behind you. It's very difficult to document even with the video. How the combination of works work in time. So all those things are undocumentable. So the exhibition is fragmented, open, and temporary. And misreadings and rewritings are unavoidable. So the curator also has to accept, like that, as we said, people just have seen a fragment of his show and that they already have an opinion, which might be totally wrong because they have not seen the rest, but curator just has to accept it. And also to accept that this show might be reproduced differently. It's very difficult to reproduce a show. Now there are attempts of it, like this Prada Foundation attempt to reproduce the famous show by Harald Zeman, when attitudes become form, when they tried to reproduce the fragments of the space, not just the work themselves, but the fragments of the space inside this Venetian palazzo. This was an interesting attempt, which of course could not have been anything else as a failure. All of this gives a very special attitude to the notion of quality, which exists in contemporary art in principle, and I can immediately see people from contemporary art field and people from other fields in their attitude to the quality. Like we're watching one film, let's say, people of a more professional film kind, like can immediately dismiss it, and the art people who might see how incomplete, non-perfect this film is, but still they are much more tolerant, I would say, to this shifting notion of quality, or quality in a non-quantitative way. So this film has quality in the sense it has, in German, Eigenschaft. It has some quality, which can be different, it can be good or bad, whatever, but it has something in it, which we will not compare by quantity to something. It's not like 20 degrees better than other thing. No, but we'll look at it and say, there is something interesting in it. I will look at it, maybe there is something. So there is sense of tolerance, which people in contemporary art field strangely share. And the curators also have to be that tolerant about how their work will be actually read and presented. But how do we read it? How do we read this curatorial narrative? A couple of more images. So this is the work of Pedro Romero, a Spanish artist who is very close to the curator in his attitude. He's basically creating a curatorial archive of iconoclastic gesture during the Spanish Civil War, something extremely interesting, not known, which is exhibited. So here it's just several sheets A4, which you basically can read, but normally there are immense piles of materials, texts, information. It's totally impossible. You should spend a year in this room trying to read all of it. So this is how it was exhibited in one of the manifestos in Murcia. Then another room in Enwezor show, so those archival displays. So what are we looking for? How do we grasp curatorial narrative? Being a critic, for instance, or a curator who came again to the Venice Biennial, again the same example, and you have very little time. So what should you see to be able to say, at least have a right to say, okay, I have seen the show. What do you have to see? Of course, the beginning and the end. And this is what everybody wants to say. Okay, I have to see the beginning of Arsenale and the beginning of Italian Pavilion. So I have to get an idea how he starts. And this is indeed really very important. If you remember all the Venice biennials lately, this is something curators really invested themselves in a statement. Like this was the beginning of Enwezor show, this Abdelab Desemet with Bruce Nauman. Interesting combination, an old artist, a new artist, artist from this white world, artist from this colonized world, how it works together. So it was a statement, or that sort of statement which everybody makes for the facade of the Italian Pavilion. So everybody in this narrative, we have to see at least the beginning of the endings, and the beginnings are always better. With the endings in Venice, there is always a problem. There's no real ending. But what, besides that, what actually are we reading? If we are trying to find our way in between this beginning and end very quickly, so what do we try to grasp? What are we looking at? Because we all know what we are doing, but it's never said. It's never written what we are doing. We are trying to grasp the criteria of choice. So I'm switching now to the notion of choice, something crucial, or selection, crucial in my narrative. Not the choice, not that much the choice itself that interests us, but the criteria of choice. By seeing artists whom the curators has chosen, we're trying to understand why and what was his idea behind it. And this is why, this is how we will say in the evening, okay, I understood what he wanted to do. Or, that makes sense. Even if you do not agree, let's say, with his criteria, but okay, that makes sense, what he did. I understand that. If that doesn't make sense, then that's bad. That it means that these criteria are just not easily understandable for you. That means that curating is one of the post-avant-garde practices, because this notion of criteria is something that characterized in the first place the artistic gesture. The self-reflection and this media critique as exposure of criteria. I'm reminding you of Clement Greenberg, who made it an important part of modernist aesthetics. For him, classical modernist painting is exposing the criteria of paintingness, yeah, so to speak, which would be flatness, color, line. So the artist, instead of waiting for the critic that will come and say that this line is very interesting and beautiful and thin, Mondrian is painting this line in itself, yeah, so to speak. So doing the work for the critic, exposing this criteria of art. So this exposure of criteria, there's some sort of self-critique, how Greenberg actually puts it. It's something which continues in the work of curator, who's also exposing his criteria. Okay, I have seen Massimiliano Gioni. I understood that his idea is that every artist is a little bit crazy, he's a madman, and we have to incorporate more of outsiders' art into art history. Okay, that's his point. I understood it. I have seen Okwui Enwezor show. This is a completely different idea, which has to do with post-colonial sensibility, political, social problematics, and his point is this and that. So that's and this is why he has chosen those artists and not those artists. But sometimes I cannot understand, and I'm asking myself, still okay, I understand his point, but then why wasn't it? What does it mean? Why did he? Yeah. So this is something I'm still unpicking. So the core of it is actually selection. So the curator is the one who's selecting artists. The issue of selection is at the core of the current morally ambivalent attitude to contemporary art and curating to society as such. And there is such a moral ambivalent attitude in society to contemporary art. As Boris Groys has written on several occasions, artist and curator represent two different types of choice. The artist represents the sovereign choice, accepted by society with the idea of art's autonomy, while curator represents the institutional choice, the one defined by the use of public funding and expected to be democratic. However, I would say it's more mixed, and the notion of freedom and sovereignty of art is now de facto questioned, as art is also understood as public service, and artist as public servant, and it's absolutely possible that like city authorities would say, why did you do this work with Roma migrants, although like Syrian migrants would be more important for our society? Like something which would be unimaginable like 20 years ago, now totally imaginable, so they feel totally entitled to look at an artist's work as they would look at the curatorial works as a public service. So this sovereign choice is questioned. On the other hand, curators sometimes getting this sovereign choice. Like for instance, Massimiliano Gioni, whom I mentioned, he did an interesting biennial. He exhibited indeed lots of things which normally are outside the tradition of, outside their normative corpus of art history. Outsiders art, but also some rare stuff, provincial stuff, strange stuff. And this was indeed very interesting, and this was totally accepted under their idea of his own choice. Curators are now less expected to show something unambitiously good. I was the one to complain and theorize a little bit on the topic that curators are only expected to show something good. So if you are showing something, everybody assumes you think it has quality and it's somehow good art. And you are not allowed as a curator, it was very difficult to exhibit some bad art, let's say, or not so good art, or some even reactionary art, as it would be normal in an, let's say, historical exhibition or anthropological exhibition. In the field of contemporary art, it was not really accepted, because there was an assumption that what you exhibit has quality. Now it's much less the case, I would say, with this more trust in curatorial choice as the sovereign one. It is accepted that curator can show anything he or she wants, which is not, sometimes not even an artwork, whatever. So there's much more movement in this direction. But the gesture of choice still has some moral issues around it. So there is a contradictory moral view of choice in contemporary capitalist society. The notion of choice often represents freedom in the public imaginary, so something, the best we can actually have as freedom. And freedom is indeed understood as freedom of choice in the first place, but only if this choice is potential and unconsummated. We can identify freedom to choice only if choice is represented by the specter of something, like in supermarket, an immense choice of different yogurts. So this is, you have freedom to choose any of them, but only if you have this large choice unconsummated. And this is exactly what the curator is often expected to do in a group show, and especially a biennial. This is why Terry Smith wrote ironically that the curator, I quote, organizes opportunities for consumption. This is what curators usually do. Are expected to do, this is the choice curators are expected to make in biennials. In biennials, curator is expected to show something to show a variety of media, genres, artists, nationalities, and topics. For instance, if someone is invited for a biennial, to do a biennial, and he says that he wants to do a solo show as a biennial, like everybody would say that you're crazy. It's just impossible, although it was not written anywhere that the biennial could not be a solo show. One. But biennial is expected to have a variety of everything, to have this unconsummated choice, so the consumer can come and choose. So I would look at this film and that installation today. On the other hand, the consummated choice, when the curator is really choosing something, the result of a selection, especially by an individual or an institution in power, is sometimes frowned upon for not being democratic enough, for not including enough women, local artists, foreign artists, migrant artists, young artists, old artists, painters, photographers. There is always something to complain, so there is not enough. Individual choice is slightly suspicious as a tyrannical one, and understood as a rejection and exclusion of everything else, which is, of course, right. Recently, the very notion of individual choice was put in a different context, which affected curating as well. Artistically curated events are defined in contrast to artistically uncurated ones. There are also events which are not curated. For instance, art fairs, or auctions, or various sorts of top 10, for instance, like 10 most expensive artists. It is uncurated by curators. Who curated those events? The market. So this invisible hand of the market is an alternative to curating, whose the invisible hand of the market is creating those top 10s, these auctions, those fairs. And this hand is more and more powerful, as we know. And if you are using social networks or even internet, in principle, not even Facebook, just your mail program, you know that you are getting targeted advertising all the time. You Googled something about Istanbul once, now you are getting advertisement about Istanbul hotels for the whole year. So everything you are doing is being monitored, and this invisible hand of the market is now curating your page on Facebook. You know that what you're getting is also curated by someone or by some mechanisms. So everything is curated, and in this situation, the individual curating by a curator is becoming a protest activity. It is becoming a sort of, I would say, prestigious hand-sorted selection. So if you have your Facebook page curated by some mechanisms who's sending you advertisements and posts of people whom you wrote recently to, or whom you mentioned, you know that you're immediately getting all the posts by them. And it's very annoying, of course, because these machines, they're not really getting whom we like, and they're not really getting what we want to see. And in this situation, this hand-picked curating, is this choice and this selection curators make. And thus in this cultural situation it's becoming more prestigious and more interesting, especially because for the broad public, all the choices and all the selection in our field, in the field of contemporary art, are completely mysterious. It's absolutely impossible to prove why this particular work by Jeff Koons is good and that is bad. And even if like 10 people in the room immediately agree on that, and the 11th person who's outside the art field, he or she just thinks that we are fooling him. Because how come you all agree, but it's impossible to say. So all these criteria and selections are very strange and mysterious, and this hand-picked and sorted selection is something curators provide. So to cut the story short, the curatorial gesture includes 3 necessary procedures. First, we just exposed, first is selection. Selection is decontextualization. The curators is choosing an artist or an artwork and taking it out of the context. Then the second gesture, montage or recontextualization. Putting it together with something else, and this is something I call framing. And then there is a third gesture, which is public display. All these 3 gestures have to take place before we would be able to talk about the curatorial, even if it's not necessarily exhibition, it can be also a symposium, for instance. But then we're choosing a speaker, putting him or her together with another speaker, we're creating some sort of a montage, constellation, we think, oh, that might be interesting in putting them together, and then publicly displaying all of it. So these 3 gestures are necessary. So what about the second one, recontextualization? This non-curatorial display excludes context. This white cube, an artwork, is outside any context, in this modernist pure situation, isolated. Curating includes it back in a different constellation, so display works as displacement. The work is necessarily displayed, displaced, and put together with something else. This is not an innocent operation, as besides expressing curator's agenda, it also retrospectively changes, or at least corrects and questions artists' intentions. This is what I call framing in this sense of this, mystery novels. Curator frames individual artworks for the crime of a content. So the curator makes an artist guilty of some content which the artist might not have in mind. So curator contextually ascribes a meaning to artworks, implying some sort of premeditation. Or another term is turning. Curator can also turn. This is from spy novels. Maybe I'm reading too many of them. So curators are turning artworks into agents of his or her narrative, sometimes also changing the meaning. Maybe something just here from my practice. So this was a historical group show I did in Moscow, which was called Struggling for the Banner, Contemporary Art Between Trotsky and Stalin. This is art of cultural revolution of late 20s, early 30s. And besides having works by well-known artists and some anonymous photographs, I also have this nice but really kitschy portrait, which I literally actually took from the wall of one oligarch's bedroom. So he keeps it in his bedroom, and he said, "You know what? I have one thing for you for this exhibition, but I really can give it to you for several weeks. I will miss it." So this flamboyant nude, it's actually also some sort of social and political statement, used to be by an artist to paint something in this revolutionary times. So I combined it together with this photo, with this worker is looking at her But I certainly ascribed lots of meanings to those works they might not have had. So by putting them together, by framing them in this curatorial narrative, this was something which I strongly implied here. One thing I want to show from that. Framing also means creating artworks out of nowhere. This is another exhibition I did, also a historical show about an obscure artist, Subotin Permyak, who was one of the pupils of avant-garde artists, absolutely unknown and not really innovative. But I created a narrative about his life where I put some quotes from his letters, which were very emotional and extremely full of some, you know, I don't know how to describe, so very emotional lines about how he cares about art. Only art was in the center of his life, nothing else. So this is why I put those quotes as slogans here, or also took one of these maps of an institution he was creating, which I found in his diaries, and enlarged it into a huge work of art, also framing something to be a work of art, something which was not. Or that stuff, for instance, it is a painting of him which we discovered, or was discovered before I came to the museum, in a very damaged form, extremely damaged. You see, cut, even impossible to restore it. So it stayed like that for years and years until I decided to exhibit it as it is. And by exhibiting as it is, you, of course, cannot see it differently than seeing those cuts as intentional. And then they are becoming sexual also. So it's not just the painting, but also a nude woman that was very violently cut here. So by framing this piece for being a conscious artwork, I framed it for being a consciously sexual. Also this sexual violence, so that damaged painting became actually an installation by contemporary artists of sorts. So that this is what this gesture of framing is actually doing. Other things of that kind we did with David Riff in the exhibition in Bergen, which was mentioned. Monday begins on Saturday. Just a couple of examples, by creating a little bit grotesque environment. For instance, here in this exhibition hall, we created this grotesque Palladio-like, I don't even know how to call this architectural detail. And those photos, there were Soviet photos of the 60s, like this neo-modernist times, but we created a tension between this neoclassical and postmodern maybe, or maybe even conservative reactionary context, created a tension between those photos and making them somehow responsible for that, yes, so to speak, guilty of this hidden Stalinism, yes, so to speak. Or this is again this poster of Subotin Permyak enlarged, or those paintings were literally framed on doors, exhibited on ready-made doors. Or framing artworks in such a strong situation with this. So several locations of this show, they had different names. So this was, they were called institutes. This was the Institute of Imaginary States, where these states were imagined by us as islands floating in this like sea or deep marge, I don't know how to say, of nationalism, which we created with wood chips. So this was a very strong frame, which was actually created by talking to artists. In many cases, they agreed to be framed in this way and to becoming part of a very strong, almost literary curatorial narrative. So that is the way to Anton Vidogle's video installation, where it is also framed with the door. You don't see it, but there is a door a la Ilya Kabakov here, and the TVs with science fiction films of the 60s. So the last point I will make now is about this display, this public display, and I want to stress the temporary character of it. Which I'll expose with an example of the show I did together with the artist Yuri Albert. It's his retrospective, which took place in Moscow 2 years ago, which was called "What Did the Artist Mean by That?" And this is a project where, as a curator, and we started as me as a curator, and he's an artist, and we ended up as two artists doing it together. So we decided that we can actually, and we do not want this traditional situation as curator maybe selecting works, so we really wanted to create a project. And the core of this project was the notion of public display and exhibition as something which is happening in time and not just in space. So art is increasingly identified with this growing zone of art display making. And this art display is usually taken in something which is called white space, as you know, white cube, white space, this modernist, decontextualized display. But it also happens, the art exhibition happens not just in space, but also in time. Something which is normally not that much taken into account. And this simple and minimalistic display in white cube is something which is giving place to more complex display of the type I have been showing you all this evening: archival display, research installations, curatorial displays. The main characteristic of all of them that it takes lots of time. And this is also another secret which art people share in between them, and because you never can find this information in a magazine, for instance. How much time does an exhibition take? There was no such a problem before. So with the traditional, even with Marcel Duchamp things, but art objects, paintings, sculptures, even drawings, they didn't take that much time. So it was always, one can have ignored that time, kind of think that it was not really relevant. But if critics talk to each other about a new exhibition or a new biennial, the first thing is, they're asking, how long will it take? How long should I plan to be there? Are there many long films? Are there many other, like text-based installation I have to see? And this is sort of information you cannot find anywhere. Nobody will tell you, but this is crucial to contemporary art, which starts, as you have seen by those type of display, starts to take more and more time, which we do not have. This is why we do not see this show in the whole. But still, it's also time-consuming, but exhibitions still exist not just in white space, in white cube, abstract, but also in white time. This is what I call it. So you have information about the show, but nobody even brings your attention to the fact that it will take time for you to see it. Maybe even 1 day is not enough, maybe even 1 week is not enough. But this time is abstracted, so the time is white. But we were interested in bringing the exhibition in real time it has to the temporality of it and to create a time-specific display. Something which I call time-specific as, of course, a reference to the site-specific display. Site-specific is something which is opposed to white cube. Yes, site-specific, it's where we suddenly see, oh, it's not a white cube, it's actually a post-industrial space. It might be still whitish, but there is something here in the corner, and there were some workers here, so it's a real space. We suddenly see art in real space. So in the same way, we wanted the exhibition to suddenly be in real time. So what we did, so it's a retrospective of the works by Yuri Albert, who is a prolific conceptual artist who worked in Moscow and still has been working in Moscow and Cologne now for more than 20 years, was creating paintings, drawings, texts, installations, audio, video, whatever. Very famous in Moscow. We kept the secret strictly, so nobody who came to the show did not know what they will see. They all assumed they will see his works. Instead, they have seen empty walls, but not completely empty, with texts taking the form of the artworks. So the size of the painting, or the size of the video projection, or the size of the drawing was taken by a text written either by me or by other commentators who wrote comments, explanations, short essays about those works, describing them and also telling something about their meaning. Then, during the time of the show, it was working for several months, it started to change gradually, with works arriving and covering the text. What was interesting here, that work and text were never together. So this gesture, we all know, okay, you're coming to a show, okay, this is an artwork, where is the explanation? Either here on the wall or in this booklet, okay, now I understand what is it about. So that gesture was impossible because they never were there at the same time. They were disconnected from each other until everything was covered. It was about the temporality of the show itself that was changing, but it was also about the temporality of the art, work, and text. So the art, what is happening now, that art is coming to us in bulks, yes, so to speak, in groups. Something that more or less happened to literature, let's say short stories, or especially poetry, is normally something which is coming to us, or essays for that matter. It's coming to us in books, and in the books we have a collection, it's a collection of short stories by Thomas Mann, or of essays by Roland Barthes, for instance. And we are getting it as a book. And in art, we used to think more, we still think more or less in individual artworks. But this situation is disappearing, and we are also getting, and art is being transported or circulates, or also being conceptualized in these complexes called displays or installations. And in that sense, it's acquiring this temporal dimension, which is totally suppressed often. This temporal dimension is very important to the curatorial work in itself. But this temporal dimension also makes artworks, and those units called art exhibitions, curatorial works, more precarious and more fragile. It turned out that this exhibition, the text was actually more fragile. So what happened at the opening, when people came to the opening and they have seen text instead of works, strange things actually happened. People started to read those texts, yes, and they discovered that it takes much more time than they planned. And second, they cannot socialize and read text. Something which we're all doing at the exhibition, we are looking at the works and at the same time talking to our friends at the vernissage. But that turned out to be impossible, so they really had to concentrate on the text. Then they understood quickly that the text will disappear. At that point, the book was not published. And the text, when they were not online, they were new, they were written for the show, so people started to nervously take photos of those texts. But something they would not do with paintings, but they didn't trust themselves to remember those texts, and they had a strange feeling that it will disappear and it is precarious. So it was a reflex, so I would have done it myself. So the text indeed, with its temporal dimension, is more fragile. It's how Lessing is putting it. Lessing is saying, I don't have an exact quote, but to finish my talk, and maybe I'll try to translate what he says. So, what an eye can see immediately in visual arts, he says, poet has to show slowly, part by part. And sometimes it happened that by the last part, we have already forgotten the first part. So this time-based art of poetry is actually based on the notion of memory, as Lessing says. Something which is extremely unreliable, and something which makes us extremely frustrated and nervous, because only those parts and those narratives actually creates the work in itself. This is why he says the poetry is more fragile than the painting, something which maybe not immediately clear and maybe even counterintuitive. But that project actually showed me that this temporal dimension of art, which is showing itself stronger and stronger, I would say, is something which also has this fragility and precarious dimension. So I would probably end up with that, and we can turn to your questions. And we're probably over time, but maybe we still can have.
Thank you very much, EKATERINA, for this fascinating talk, which really put in front of us a big variety, like a huge painting, monumental painting about this notion of curating. Perhaps I will come back to what you said in the beginning. There is a tendency in the art world with artists, organizations, for example, that knowledge production and also, what do you say?
Criticality. That's not enough. There is a feeling that this is not enough.
This is not enough, but it's going somewhere else towards what is also very interesting for us as an art academy, going away from the exhibition towards school or gardening or whatever. Would it mean that the question of knowledge production and criticality is not important anymore? It's the usefulness which is...
Of course it is important, it's just the artist... well, if you ask me that I'm still into knowledge production, very much so. I am not quitting this field, I'm not deserting this field, no. But it's interesting how artists or curators might feel that it's being colonized by the capitalism, and they try to find new freedom. That field was already some sort of freedom from the market. So what was first was the private market, and artists said at the beginning of 20th century, maybe even earlier, that they want to quit this field towards, and massively in the 60s, towards knowledge production, immaterial work. But then it happened that it was colonized, and now every manager is a curator, and everybody accepted. It turned out that this immaterial production is very good for capitalism, it's even better. So that's now, strangely, the artists go back. They say, okay, then we go to material, then we'll grow apples and potatoes. So that is something which is happening.
But the way the word curating is used, or the expression curating is used, when everything is created, it gets totally meaningless. No?
Yeah. Well, we're very much on this way, of course, that everything is curated. Yes, so I think something will be invented, something else, some other term will be invented soon. Yeah. Or it might, maybe, I hope maybe it will not be fashionable anymore. I don't know, they will find something more fashionable.
Yeah, who knows? And there's one other question which came into my mind. You said when we enter a biennial, like we did for Okwui Enwezor show in the biennial in Venice, you said we are trying to grasp the criteria of choice. And what I was wondering, I mean, yeah, we professional, you mean
yes.
Professionals?
Professionals, what the professionals do, yes.
But what I was thinking, what I wanted to ask you, what is this encounter with an original artwork? Is it also important?
Yes, it's just totally different layers. Same people were saying, I want to see Hito Steyerl, I want to see the new work of, I don't remember what, let's say Fred Jar, I don't know. So I have some individual works I want to see, even if it's long, I want to see a fast movie, but I also have to get an idea of Okwui Enwezor show. And this is something which only professionals do. Of course, the broad audience is only interested in individual works. Nobody's asking themselves what Okwui Enwezor wanted to say. So this notion of curator only exists on this professional level. But of course, it was interesting to me how immediately everybody knows how differently they have to look at those two things, and everybody already mastered that. Nobody is complaining that they don't have time. Everybody knows that is how it is meant to be. So we will see the work and we'll see the curator's work.
And what I really liked was that you said at the beginning is so important, because when one has seen many biennials, I remember
the beginning always.
Yeah, always, and they see, oh, there were the tampons hanging there, and then there was this and that. Yeah.
Yes.
So I would like to give the questions to the audience.
Well, I was wondering...
But there's a microphone, perhaps you take it.
So, as I understand it, this SummerAcademy is specifically concerned with the question of the production of meaning, which is something you touched upon on a couple of occasions, but you maybe didn't spell out to what extent the curatorial is about the production of meaning. So I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on that.
Okay, that's very simple. The curatorial is actually the production meaning. This is the way of meaning production today. That's how the meaning is produced. The meaning is produced in a combination of things, putting things together and displaying them publicly. This is how the curatorial, this is what Maria meant, she's totally right when she writes that this is the most typical way of knowledge production today, not just for a curator, but also for an artist who is not supposed to create something new that never existed, but every artist is supposed to look at what already exists, to put some of those things together, even in a very practical way, in your artwork. So the curatorial is this way of knowledge production.
But is knowledge the same as meaning?
Good question. Probably not, but we can speak of both, I would say. Probably meaning is a knowledge exposed. So here we have to then talk about this notion of display. How this gesture of display is actually crucial to all this practice. Because as I said, if you are not displaying something, it just doesn't exist, as you know, in both art, and I'm not saying whether it's good or not, I'm not actually into moral discussion, very much against it. But something which we can see is, of course, that the gesture of display is something that only guarantees the existence of anything in contemporary world. Although this display can be in social media, can be in exhibition, but knowledge in itself, you know, if you are producing knowledge in your own head, it just doesn't exist in culture. So then it has to take the form of meaning, which means something already exposed, displayed in one or another form.
And it seems to me that the narrative, it seems to me that what you were saying about the narrative is perhaps what yields meaning ultimately, because how you put knowledge together and how you tell the story within an exhibition is what gives it then meaning.
I think that meaning emerges in interpretation. There is no meaning before you say it, someone says. There is no meaning in itself in narrative. I don't know. I think to have a meaning, you have to expose it somehow to make it visible. And here can be different, of course, positions about this.
Thank you.
EKATERINA DEGOT, thank you so much for an interesting talk. My question also concerns the gesture of display, and unfortunately I missed the Bergen biennial. But I would be very interested if you could elaborate a bit more on the curatorial display you have shown to us with the slide with the wood chips. Because for me it's quite interesting that a lot of artists seem to be willing to cooperate with the display. And this is not, as we know from the history of the exhibition, it's not something that comes by, it's very easily. So if someone like Marcel Duchamp did a similar show and put a display up on it, so this means something different. Or if Karen Seller is inviting artists to put their pieces and she makes a gesture and a Gesamtinstallation on it. So I would be very interested how the interaction and the dialogue was with the artists.
Actually, I don't know why it worked well, but it did. We wanted to have, so it was a very strange exhibition. The conditions were extremely strange. We had 11 locations. In Bergen, there is no big space for a biennial. Of course, if you do a biennial, you kind of expected to have a big post-industrial space and to put all the things together. They do not have it. At least they didn't find it for us, so we had to use 11 existing art space in town. I spent more than half a year just thinking, what does it mean? Where is the meaning of this gesture? What could it mean? And we only understood what would it mean when we decided to make a fictitious map or a fictitious network of research institutes. So we were inspired by a Soviet science fiction novel of the 60s, a short, funny novel, Monday Begins on Saturday, where researchers are working in a research institute together with magicians. All the magicians of all the cultures of the world are also working there to research human happiness, which is of course communism, and the future. And Monday Begins on Saturday because they want to work so much. So already on Saturday they dream of coming back to work on Monday. And this is how 100% I live, and this is how many artists and curators live, and of course we all live in this some imaginary communism. And so we put all these things together. Also the context of research is very important for Scandinavian art scene, Bergen in particular, so we were very much inspired by the research, artistic research, which has such a strong profile there. And we dreamed of what if it would be like Bergen under communism, and the artists are just working in this institute. So we had these 11 venues, and we had to defamiliarize them and to create small group shows in each of them, very different, and being inspired by the space itself and the works. And it was, as I understand now, extremely difficult because everything had to work together. For instance, this space with wood chips, it's a museum of design, how to say, this 19th century term I forgot, of well, applied arts and design. 19th century museum of the type Martin Gropiusbau, that sort of historicism building, and it has a very strong nationalistic feeling of 19th century, rediscovery of nation, of Norway. And we were really thinking about that and wanted to put works which were dealing with new nationalisms, or lack of them, in there. And we had some works of that kind, but then we started to think, how can we imagine this space? And we imagining it as this lake or water, I forgot the term. How do you call this? Where somewhere where you can draw. I mean, it's marsh, forgot, whatever. So we started to imagine this sort of environment and talking to artists. Also in other situations we had some other small details. We never wanted to go against artist work. We wanted to add something that would create a context for the work. What helped that there were artists who did those things themselves, who were working with environments, who were also, their work was also unstable in the sense I described. So they were able to reproduce it in different spaces, different situations, different contexts, a little bit differently. So they said that we did an upgrade to them. And it actually worked quite well. So I guess we worked as artists rather than curators. And artists actually prefer to be curated by artists, in my experience. We had lots of fun with that.
Can I just add a tiny comment? Because I was fortunate enough to see the Bergen Biennial, and it was one of my favorites. And just the other day I was talking with a former editor of Frieze who told me that in all his career as a curator he's never seen a successful biennial, which I thought was quite mind-boggling. And I mentioned, well, actually I have the one in Bergen, General Assembly.
Oh, thank you very much.
And I think what made it really successful and beautiful was this matter of framing that you talked about.
Yeah,
it was just, you put a lot of care to give it unity in the way it was framed. Even visual unity with the way things were labeled, the timepieces as well. So all that.
Yeah, we have these clocks and plants and everything.
And the copper inscriptions. It just made it beautiful, and it gave the 11 venues unity, and it was a pleasure of moving from one page show to another, but it all being held together by this narrative, the semi-fictional narrative.
Oh, thank you very much. That's a very pleasant surprise. Swamp it is called, I
remember. Thank you very much for the inspirational talk, and I actually have a few questions. I'll try to put it as short as possible. So one is about the last show you were showing to us. So it involves the change in the temporality of experiencing the artworks. But how did you work with the audience then? You were mentioning the opening. Was there any closing event? What was happening during the exhibition? Because it's obviously changing the whole attitude to exhibition making and inviting the audience.
we did several discussions during the show. especially because of that. So people would come to see it in transition. So we used the opportunity for our professionals to come to see the show in transition, something you're normally not doing. But for the normal audience, the museum, there were people who were asking for money back. But the museum was very cool about that. Okay, we'll give you money.
Yeah, thank you. The other question is, you were talking about the impossibility of seeing shows in the total, and I was just wondering how curators work with that. Is that an issue in a practical sense? Maybe it's also kind of a gesture that they share with artists. Okay, we don't have to be create a clear message that has its beginning and the end, and everybody has to get it, but more given a possibility to explore it. So kind of another opportunity of comparing it with artist gesture, but in a very practical sense, how do curators deal with this factor, and is that an issue for them?
Well, as we see, curators are creating exhibitions bigger and bigger, and longer and longer. So it seems they are okay with that. So we know that it was an artistic gesture long ago, like starting with Warhol, with his Sleep film and other films, which were long, like 7 hours. And you know the story that there was a woman who, like 10 years ago, it turned out that she's the one, she was a researcher, and she was the first one who actually has seen the whole film, because at some point the window is moving and you see the reflection of Andy Warhol for a couple of seconds. But nobody has seen it before. You know, so he might have put anything inside this film, like a murder scene, and nobody could have seen it. So he had probably enjoyed it, that he's creating something that nobody can see. So maybe it's something like that, but I would say that curators are just also cool about it. So they know that nobody will be able to see the show in the hall. Like I also knew with Bergen, unfortunately there were longer films and people came for a short time, but I'm so glad that there is still, it could give an impression of unity, even if you weren't probably not able to see absolutely everything. So I guess there is some emotional value, or maybe intellectual or ethical value in the fact that it's not seen in the hall, like your whole life. Like for instance, nobody will know you 100%. Not even your mother, not even your lover, not even your children. Never. And we have to accept it. So maybe it's like that.
And don't you think it's also a little bit like we navigate all the time, we navigate through the internet, people are, I mean, not here, fortunately, but often you go to lectures and people are responding their emails or so. They do many things at the same time, yeah? And so you can also, you're used to not seeing everything.
Yeah, this is something which maybe even lost this poignancy of it. What I just described, maybe I'm of older generation, I have this poignancy, like I will not be able to see all the monuments in Rome, like never in my life, because I don't have time. Okay, so I will be sad. But maybe contemporary people, like the younger people, they are not sad about it. Maybe they just accept it.
Yeah.
Thank you. So at one point in your talk, you contrasted the way we evaluate quality between a movie where you see something in the paper that might say, rank it, say, from 0 to 10, with the way we evaluate the quality of an artwork. And then at another point, using, I guess, Rob Storr's quote, you compared curating to being the author of a film. So in that sense, do you think that the quality of curating isn't as shifting as maybe the quality or the way that we think about the quality of an artwork? I guess I'm just curious about if the...
Curious about what?
Curious about the notions of quality in terms of it shifts for an artwork. Is it also as shifting for curating, or would you evaluate it differently?
Well, as you know, we're trying, like we in art world, trying not to use the word quality, as it is like smells a little bit conservative. Like if it's in this traditional notion of quality, it implies this craft things, like you learn to do something as a drawing or as a filmmaker or as a musician, then it has quality. So there is a level. So there is no quality, then it has quality, and you can measure. So this has more quality, and this is something like conservative, and we're trying not to use it. This is why we now use the word value sometimes. Like, so what creates value more? But then I'm trying to see how do we still use, if we still use the word quality or something instead of the word quality, and how it is different from these more traditional arts, let's say like traditional music or traditional cinema. They still use it in a more traditional way, and how are we using? So I think that art people, including curators, are ready to, we are much more generous to seeing quality in many things, in more things than, let's say, I don't know, film professionals of Hollywood cinema would do. So we see something which is unfinished, unfocused, yeah, of course, something which has, but bad sound is bad. Yeah, that's what I'm telling my students. Bad sound, I'm not really ready to tolerate. But bad visuals sometimes work even better. And so I look at those students' work and say, yeah, there is, and I start to think, okay, what could it have been? So maybe there, so we think what we see, and we also think what we can imagine behind it. And this is also how we look at exhibitions. Okay, we have seen the beginning of the biennial and the end, and then we think maybe there is something in between, and we kind of add, we help this exhibition by our own thinking. We inscribe our own thinking into it, but I think it's good. It's normally said that this is something bad, and there's a critical thinking in the artwork, something which is not there, but I think it's a good procedure. And this is how we can work with quality in a non-quantitative way. I mean that it's not like one quality is better than another quality. There are different qualities. And if it's substantial enough, if this quality is clear enough, if we look at the artwork of an exhibition or an exhibition and we understand what it is, then it has quality. Although it's not necessarily better than another quality. That's what I mean.
No questions anymore? Okay, then I would like to thank everybody and just mention that there is an exhibition in this space as well, which is kind of destroyed or displaced at the moment. It's by Paloma Vargas-Weiss, and I would like to thank the team of the Salzburger Kunstler and the team of the SummerAcademy, and of course, foremost, you, EKATERINA. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much also for very interesting questions and very, very pleasantly spending.